Welcome to the Academic Woman Amplified podcast. I'm your host, Kathy Mazak, tenured full professor, mom of three, and firm believer that the culture of academia needs to change radically. Women are revolutionizing academia within institutions that were not built for us. If you're ready to reject the culture of overwork, kick guilt and overwhelm to the curb, and amplify your voice to make a real impact on your field without breaking down or burning out, you're in the right place. And it all starts with writing. Let's go. Hello there. Today, I want to go back in time and tell you a story about myself as an early career researcher. The reason I want to talk about this is really related to this idea that what we see in our colleagues and the accomplishments of others is just one slice of a long journey. And I think that by exposing kind of the less prestigious parts of that journey and the actual length of how long it takes to get to kind of the level that some of us have gotten to, the more that we can see that exposed, the more that researchers and scholars will get confidence about their own journeys. So get ready. Today we are going back in time to when I was a grad student and early career researcher to tell you the story of a too long qualitative research journey. Now, before I dive in, I want you to know that this podcast is one of a short series that I'm going to be doing dedicated to qualitative research. Today, I'm telling a story. Next week, I'm going to talk about, what to do when your qualitative research gets rejected. Now, for everyone else out there who's listening, who's not a qualitative researcher, I want you to know that I've got you, I have you in mind, and I am designing these episodes with the idea that everybody who's listening can get something out of them about writing and publishing. So stay tuned, everyone. Get on board with my qualitative research story. All right. The beginning of my story takes place in East Lansing, Michigan, when I was studying for my PhD. I was about 29 years old, and my doctoral experience was pretty much close to perfect. And what I mean by that is I had an amazing team of advisors. My doctoral advisor and the other three professors on my committee were amazingly supportive, just outstanding scholars in their fields. I was able to take the classes I really wanted to. And so besides the kind of normal pain around the East Lansing winters and, the stress of studying, because it is stressful, I really have to say that it was kind of a dreamy experience, I think, compared to a lot of people's doctoral experience. So I had this team of 4 world-class women scholars who graciously trained and mentored me through my dissertation design, data collection, and writing. And I actually loved my dissertation. This is something else that can sometimes be unusual. I mean, of course, like everyone, by the time I got to the end of it, I was a little sick of looking at it. But overall, I loved researching it. I loved writing it. And I practically did cartwheels when the Spencer Foundation awarded me a dissertation fellowship to complete it. So it was just like this cherry on the top that, like a really big cherry on the top, that I got to spend the last year of my dissertation work funded by the Spencer Foundation. So that was really, really amazing. I was super proud of the research itself. And again, there were pains in it, but it was overall a very joyful and kind of cup-filling dissertation project. So then when it came time to write articles from my dissertation, I felt pretty confident. I was a good writer. I had this extra confidence of support from this dissertation award. And, my advisors were supportive as well. They thought I did a good job. They wouldn't have passed me if they didn't. And, people who had read my dissertation were very positive about it. So, as one does, I lifted a chapter out of the dissertation and started to shape it into an article. The dissertation itself was an ethnographic case study. So this chapter that I lifted was I thought, was perfect for the journal that's called Anthropology and Education Quarterly. And Anthropology and Ed is a pretty high tier journal. It's niche, right? Anthropology and Ed, but it is a prestigious journal. And many of the people on the board of the journal were people who I had cited in my work. So I was like, I think this is going to be a great fit for my study. So I transformed my dissertation chapter into an article and I submitted it to Anthropology and Ed. After a few months, it came back rejected. But, and this is unusual, okay? It came back rejected, but with a lot of very helpful feedback, like good feedback, actual constructive criticism that was written in a way that I didn't feel stupid when I read it, but rather I felt like, okay, these people want this work to be better, and they're telling me how to make it better. So to my surprise, the feedback about the article really centered around study design. And I just couldn't understand it. Like, this work had been shaped by these top qualitative researchers on my committee. It had won awards. Why were the reviewers questioning study design? Well, that moment of getting that feedback began the long and arduous process of really coming to understand and be able to express qualitative research rigor. And I just want to say here that the work of becoming a researcher and a scholar is this work. It is the work of going from student to researcher, from the dissertation project to being able to command your own line of research. And in that process, there's quite a bit of like not only skill development that happens, but also like socialization into the way we talk about our research and the way we write about it. So I always say that the difference between a dissertation chapter and an article is one of rhetorical purpose. So what that means is that the rhetorical purpose of your dissertation is for you to graduate. It is to show your committee that you can be their colleague. That's the rhetorical purpose of a dissertation. And that has a bunch of repercussions for how the dissertation is written and what you include and how you say it and all of that stuff. But an article is like an arrow. It is like sharp and pointed and makes one very clear and concrete argument. And it doesn't have that kind of like, I need to show you that I'm the expert part to it. Instead, what an article demands across fields, it demands clarity, it demands an expression of the methods that is absolutely as clear and justified as possible. And I think that I understood that like in an intellectual level, but I didn't understand what it looked like to write an academic article and write the methodology part for qualitative research in such a pointedly, like exactly how detailed it needed to be, exactly how to express that there was rigor behind the decisions that I made and there was rigor in the design. And the reason I'm sharing this story is because, and I'm about to get into like how long it actually took for me to not just figure that out intellectually, but be able to do it in the writing. It took a really long time. And on one hand, like that's okay, right? Like the journey is the journey. And on the other hand, maybe there are some things that you could do if you knew, right, that it was going to take this long. Like if I could go back to myself and teach myself the lessons of qualitative rigor earlier, I would have done it. And again, this is not to say that I wasn't trained. I was well trained in qualitative research methods by absolutely top scholars. There's no doubt that I had excellent training. But this combination of like being trained and being able to do what you're trained to do, is a process. And that's what I want to talk to you more about today. Okay, so I submitted the article. I got a rejection. I got feedback though, and the feedback was around qualitative rigor. So I wrote and I rewrote. I had a really gracious colleague read it. And after I had rewritten, she gave me the same rigor-based feedback that the reviewers had, even though I thought I had fixed it. I worked on revising that article for about a year. And when I just couldn't figure out what else to say, I sent it back and submitted it again to Anthropology and Education Quarterly. So what happened next? Well, I waited. A few months went by, as it does when you're in my field. It's very typical for the review period to take months, right? And when it came back, I got a revise and resubmit. So yay, right? Like that's what we want. We want to get a revise and resubmit. But, and this is a big but, the feedback was kind of the same. In other words, like all that revision that I had done still hadn't solved the core problem of me clearly expressing rigor in my study design. So I have been working on this paper for over 2 years, much longer if you count all the years of the dissertation research. And for what? The same feedback. I stared at the screen and then I stared down at my belly. I was 8 months pregnant when I got that revise and resubmit. And so I made a choice. I'm not saying I'm proud of this choice. I am just telling you the choice I made with no judgment. And the choice I made was actually to give up. I wrote to Anthropology and Education Quarterly, and I thanked them for sending such helpful feedback, and I told them that I wouldn't be resubmitting. I took my maternity leave, and I let that article sit in a virtual drawer for at least another year. But it did not die there. Time passed, I took my maternity leave, and underneath all of this timeline that I'm telling you, and I'm actually going to give you a timeline in a minute, but underneath all of this timeline, which now like years had gone by that I was, early career on the tenure track, during all of these years, I, started developing a new line of research. I got new funding. I did new things. And all of those new things that I did were influenced by that voice in the back of my head that Anthropology and Education Quarterly had planted about qualitative rigor. So when I went to design my next study, I did it with this idea of I'm going to need to be able to express and answer this kind of feedback that I got from Anthropology and Ed. I need to be able to clearly address that. So the design of the study got better. And my ability to articulate qualitative rigor got better as well. So that was happening while my article, that original article, was in the drawer. I went on maternity. I came back. It was still just in the drawer. And probably around, months later, if not a year later, I went back to that article that had been rejected, that had gotten the revise and resubmit on the second time, with the perspective that I had gained from starting that new line of research. So I had changed as a researcher. And that's another point that I want to kind of stop here and make, which is that you're never done developing as a scholar. So this is for all my early career people and everybody really, but I feel like a lot of the time that transition from doctoral candidate to early career researcher is fraught with this, like, I was under the wing of my advisor and now I have to figure out my own path. And I just want to say to everyone in that moment that you're always figuring out your own path. You're continually developing as a scholar, and that's good. There is no end point when you can say, I am done. And that might feel exhausting, but I actually find that the invigorating part of research, that you're never like totally done. There's always a new way you can look at a problem, or a new experiment that you can design, or a new study that you can design. So never being done means there's more to learn. It means there's ways to get better, that you can lean into your strengths and develop them, that you can answer research questions more effectively as you grow and gain experience, and that, you can make knowledge more effectively and explore problems more deeply. And so all of that development had been happening while I was not resubmitting that article. And so when I turned around to finally revise it again, I was a different scholar, and I was able to do in the revision what I was not able to do earlier. And that is really express my methods well, express rigor well, and convince, reviewers that I knew what I was doing. So let me give you a timeline, for this story. So I told you that this one article was kind of languishing. Meanwhile, I was really developing myself as a scholar. I want you to see how many years this took, or not see, because it's a podcast. I want you to hear how many years this took. So in 2005 was when I won the Spencer Dissertation Fellowship. So that's when I was finishing up and writing the dissertation. In 2006, I got the tenure track job at University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez. In 2007, I submitted my article to Anthropology and Education Quarterly for the first time and got rejected and got feedback. In 2008, I took my time revising the article. In 2009, I resubmitted to Anthropology and Ed and got the revise and resubmit, and decided not to pursue it. I put it away, and in 2010, I went on maternity leave for 6 months, came back to work, and as I've told in other places, had a near breakdown. So 2010 was rough. So I didn't really work on the article very much, but towards the end of 2010, I did. And in 2011, I revised and submitted to a lower tier journal. So I had learned so much, but I just was like, I need to get this out there in the world. So I made the decision to go lower tier, and I submitted to a really great journal called the Journal of Language, Identity, and Education. And in 2012, my article was accepted and published with minor revisions. I didn't go through a huge review process at all for that journal. I was able to, sitting on, listen to this, 7 years more research experience, I was able to shape up that article, get it into the Journal of Language, Identity, and Education, and it wasn't hard. It was like, I did it. There was not a lot of writing. There was not a lot of revision. It was done. 7 years. That's a really long time. 7 years from the dissertation writing moment to the moment that this journal article that was based on the dissertation got published. And it did not go into a top tier journal. It went into a lovely mid-tier journal. So again, here's what was happening behind the scenes those 7 years. I started a new line of research funded by $500,000 in grants. We designed and collected data for new studies. We presented on them, and we got published a whole other set of articles in the Journal of Bilingualism and Bilingual Ed and other places. And through all of this, I kept that very kindly and constructively delivered critical feedback about qualitative rigor in the back of my head. And that feedback helped me to be a better qualitative researcher. And I figured out what was missing, and I developed it. It took 7 years, but I did it. And are you ready for the best part? Years later, not that many years later, but years later, when a colleague and I decided to write up a new article for Anthropology and Education Quarterly, it was accepted with minor revisions on the first shot. Yes, there's a happy ending to this story. As if getting the original article published eventually after 7 years wasn't enough, the super happy ending and the what really I think shows my growth as a qualitative researcher is that when I finally went back in 2017 and submitted another article on a completely different study to Anthropology and Education Quarterly, it was snapped up. Very, very low amounts of feedback, minor revisions. I had mastered the qualitative design and I had mastered the qualitative rigor expression that I needed to master in order to get into that top tier journal. I hope that you found some part of this story to be affirming for you, if not inspiring, because I'm not sure that it's super inspiring to have taken 7 years to publish an article. And I do want to just say, lots of other stuff got published in those 7 years, just that article took that long. But I want you to take some knowledge and some kind of confidence in your own journey from this story. And know that even a journey that feels too long, that maybe was too long, frankly, still leads us to a place of development in our scholarship. So now when I think about publishing academic articles in qualitative research, I know how to do it, right? It's much faster. The process is sped up for me, and it's sped up by better design and better, a refined ability to express qualitative rigor when I'm writing up the methodology section. Writing up the data never was a problem. The data is so beautiful and I was always, I think, pretty good at presenting data in a compelling way. But that part of the methodology and the rigor was something that it really took me a long time to nail. To finish up this episode, I want to tell you that the process is the process. And I want you to be able to reflect on your own process and your own journey without judgment. And to be able to say, hey, this is what it was. This is what I learned from it. And I will take all that learning and continue to develop as a scholar and a researcher. On next week's podcast, I'm going to be talking more like a how-to about what to do when you get feedback or a rejection of your qualitative work. So anybody who writes for interdisciplinary journals is going to want to hear that episode. And anyone who struggles around the process of dealing with feedback and figuring out what to do with a rejection and what to do with a revise and resubmit. If you have trouble around that process, next week's episode is for you. Talk to you then. Thank you so much for spending your valuable time loving on yourself and your writing by listening to this episode. If you're feeling pulled in 1,000 directions and can't seem to carve out time to write, I've got a solution for you. Go grab my 10 ways to make time to write cheat sheet. Just go to kathymazak.com/podcast-time to learn my best quick tips for putting writing at the center of your career where it belongs. We'll link that up in the show notes. Just go to kathymazak.com/podcast-time.